The scream that shattered the mountain silence was raw and primal, the kind that made a man's blood turn to ice in his veins. Declan Hawthorne bolted upright from his bedroll, his powerful frame instantly alert as another sound followed the scream. The long, menacing howl of wolves, too close, too many. Without thinking, without even grabbing his boots, he launched himself into the darkness, his bare feet pounding against the rocky ground as he ran toward the terrified cries echoing through the Colorado wilderness. His cabin sat 3 miles from Fort Lyon, perched high in the foothills where he could trap and hunt in solitude, where the world left him alone with his thoughts and his ghosts. But tonight someone had ventured too close to the wild places, and those wolves sounded hungry. Declan crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at his bare chest, stones cutting into his feet, but he barely felt it. His long dark hair whipped behind him as he ran, his muscled legs eating up the distance with the kind of speed that came from years of living in these mountains. The September night air was cold against his skin, but sweat broke out across his broad shoulders as he pushed himself harder. The woman's screams had stopped, replaced by desperate sounds of struggle, and that terrified him more than anything. He knew these mountains, knew every trail and stream, and he could picture exactly where she must be. The small clearing near Willow Creek where travelers sometimes made camp when they didn't know better. When he burst into the clearing, his heart nearly stopped. A woman stood atop a boulder, a flaming branch clutched in her shaking hands, while 4 gray wolves circled below her like demons in the firelight. Her camp was destroyed, supplies scattered everywhere, and her small fire had been kicked apart in her desperate bid to create a torch. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, with long dark hair that fell wild around her shoulders and eyes wide with terror. "Hey!" Declan roared, his voice booming across the clearing like thunder. The wolves' heads snapped toward him, their eyes reflecting the firelight with an eerie green glow. He didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. He grabbed a thick fallen branch as he ran, swinging it like a club as he charged straight into the pack. The wolves scattered momentarily, surprised by this new threat, but they didn't run far. These weren't ordinary wolves, scared of humans. These were desperate, driven by hunger that made them bold. The largest one, a massive male with scarred muzzle, turned to face Declan, lips pulled back in a snarl that showed every sharp tooth. "Get down and get behind me," Declan shouted to the woman, positioning himself between her and the pack. His feet were bleeding from the run, leaving dark prints on the stone, but he stood firm, his powerful arms holding the branch like a weapon. His chest heaved with exertion, muscles rippling in the firelight as he faced down the alpha wolf. The woman didn't argue. She jumped down from the boulder with surprising agility and pressed herself against his back, still clutching her burning branch. He could feel her trembling, feel the rapid beat of her heart against his shoulder blade. "Whatever happens, keep that fire going," he said, his voice steady despite the danger. "They hate fire more than they hate us." The alpha wolf lunged without warning, and Declan swung hard, catching it across the shoulder with enough force to send it tumbling. But the others came in from the sides, teeth snapping, and he had to spin and swing again, using his body to shield the woman behind him. One wolf got too close, and Declan kicked out with his bare foot, connecting with its jaw and sending it yelping into the darkness. "There's a knife in my belt," he told the woman, never taking his eyes off the circling pack. "Back right side, take it." Her hand fumbled at his waist, her fingers brushing against his skin as she found the hunting knife and pulled it free. "I've got it," she whispered, her voice shaking but determined. The wolves were regrouping, and Declan knew they didn't have much time. The alpha was back on its feet, blood dripping from its mouth where it had bitten its own tongue in the fall. These animals were starving, probably driven down from higher elevations by lack of game, and they wouldn't give up easily. "When I say run, we run together toward those trees," Declan said, jerking his head toward the pine forest on the north side of the clearing. "Stay with me, don't look back, and for God's sake don't fall." "I can't just leave my things," she protested, but there was no real conviction in her voice. She knew as well as he did that things didn't matter when you were dead. "Your things won't matter if you're wolf food," he shot back. "On my count. 1. The alpha charged again, and 2 others came with it this time. A coordinated attack that showed intelligence and desperation in equal measure. Declan swung his branch in a wide arc, forcing them back, but his makeshift weapon was splintering, wouldn't last much longer. 2. The woman's hand gripped the back of his belt, holding on like a lifeline. He could hear her breathing, rapid and shallow, could smell the fear rolling off her in waves. But she was still standing, still fighting, and that was more than some men would have done. 3. Run! They broke for the tree line together, Declan's long legs covering ground fast while the woman kept pace beside him, the burning branch held high like a beacon. The wolves gave chase immediately, their howls rising into the night sky, calling to others that might be nearby. Declan's feet screamed in agony with every step, torn and bleeding, but he pushed the pain down deep where it couldn't slow him. They crashed into the forest, and Declan immediately started climbing, pulling himself up into the branches of a massive pine tree with the kind of strength that came from hauling beaver traps and bear carcasses through mountain passes. "Come on," he urged, reaching down for the woman. "Give me your hand." She threw her torch down into the dried needles below, creating a barrier of flame, then grabbed his outstretched hand. Her grip was strong, her palm calloused from work, and he hauled her up with ease, his powerful arms lifting her weight like it was nothing. They climbed higher, branch by branch, until they were 15 feet off the ground, safe from the snapping jaws below. The wolves circled the base of the tree, their frustration evident in every growl and bark. The fire from the thrown torch was spreading slowly through the dry undergrowth, creating a ring of flame that kept the pack at bay. Declan settled onto a thick branch, his back against the trunk, and pulled the woman close against his side to keep her from falling. She was shaking violently now, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving shock in its wake. "You're safe now," he said quietly, wrapping one muscled arm around her shoulders. "They'll give up once they realize we're out of reach." She didn't respond, just pressed her face against his bare chest and started to cry, great shuddering sobs that shook her whole body. Declan held her, his big hand stroking her hair awkwardly, not quite sure what to do with a crying woman, but knowing she needed comfort. Below them, the wolves continued their vigil, but their howls were already sounding more distant, less certain. "What's your name?" he asked after a while when her tears had slowed to hiccups. "Wilhelmina," she managed, her voice muffled against his skin. "Wilhelmina Hart. Most people call me Willa, Declan Hawthorne," he replied. "I've got a cabin about 3 miles north of here. Once those wolves clear out, I'll take you there. You'll be safe until morning." She pulled back slightly to look up at him, and even in the dim moonlight filtering through the pine branches, he could see she was beautiful. Not in the delicate, fragile way of town women, but with a strength in her features that spoke of resilience and determination. Her eyes were dark, maybe brown or deep green. It was hard to tell in the shadows, and her face was smudged with dirt and ash. "You ran through the forest barefoot," she said, as if only just now realizing it. "Your feet must be torn to pieces." Declan shrugged, though the movement made him wince. Now that he was sitting still, the pain was starting to make itself known with a vengeance. "Didn't have time to stop for boots. I heard you scream. You could have been killed," Willa whispered. "You didn't even know me, and you ran straight into a wolf pack with nothing but a stick. Couldn't very well let you get eaten," he said gruffly. "Not the kind of man I am." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wolves below gradually lose interest and wander off into the night. The fire from the torch had burned itself out, leaving only glowing embers and the acrid smell of smoke. Declan's arms stayed wrapped around Willa's shoulders, and she didn't pull away, seemed to find comfort in his solid presence beside her. "What were you doing camping out here alone?" he finally asked. "Fort Lyon's only about 5 miles south. Why not stay in town?" Willa sighed, a long exhale that spoke of exhaustion and frustration. "I'm a school teacher. I was hired by the territorial governor to teach in Fort Lyon, arrived on the stage this afternoon. But when I got there, I found out the previous teacher had burned down the schoolhouse in some kind of accident 3 months ago, and they haven't rebuilt it yet. The hotel was full, and nobody seemed particularly interested in helping a stranger find lodging, so I figured I'd camp out here until I could sort things out in the morning." "That's Fort Lyon for you," Declan muttered. "Not the friendliest town in Colorado. Most folks there are too busy with their own troubles to care much about anyone else's." He shifted on the branch, trying to find a more comfortable position, and felt fresh blood oozing from the cuts on his feet. "Why'd you come all the way out here from wherever you're from?" "Can't imagine the pay's much good, Boston," Willa said. "I came from Boston. And no, the pay isn't good, but I needed to get away. Start fresh somewhere nobody knew me." She paused, then added quietly, "My father died 6 months ago. He was a professor at Harvard, and when he passed, I found out he'd been living far beyond his means. There were debts, so many debts. They took the house, the furniture, everything. I had nothing left but my teaching certificate and enough money for a stage ticket west." Declan felt something twist in his chest at the pain in her voice. He understood loss, understood running from ghosts that haunted familiar places. "I'm sorry about your father," he said simply. "That's a hard thing to lose." "Did you lose someone?" Willa asked, tilting her head to look up at him. "Is that why you live alone up here in the mountains instead of in town?" He was quiet for a long moment, debating whether to answer. He didn't talk about his past, hadn't spoken of it to anyone in the 3 years since he'd come to these mountains. But something about this woman, about the way she'd faced down those wolves with nothing but a burning branch and sheer determination, made him want to trust her with the truth. "My wife," he said finally, "and my son. They died of fever back in Missouri, winter of 1875. I couldn't stay there after. Couldn't look at the places we'd been happy without seeing their faces everywhere. So I packed what I could carry and headed west, kept going until I found a place remote enough that the memories couldn't follow. Willa's hand found his free one, her fingers intertwining with his calloused, scarred knuckles. I'm so sorry, Declan. That's a terrible burden to carry. We all carry something, he replied. Yours just happens to be a little fresher than mine. They stayed in the tree until the sky began to lighten in the east, a gradual shift from black to deep blue to the first hints of pink and gold. The wolves were long gone, their howls nothing but an echo in Declan's memory. His feet had stopped bleeding but had stiffened up badly, and he knew the walk back to his cabin was going to be agony. Come on, he said, beginning to climb down. We should get moving before it gets too hot. It's going to be a long walk, and I'm not exactly in prime condition to carry you if you get tired. Willa followed him down, moving with the same agility she'd shown earlier. When they reached the ground, she immediately went to examine his feet, kneeling in the dirt and lifting one to inspect the damage. Her touch was gentle but efficient, the touch of someone who'd dealt with injuries before. These are bad, she said, frowning. You've got cuts, bruises, and at least 2 thorns embedded in the heel. You shouldn't be walking on these at all. Don't have much choice, Declan pointed out. Unless you know how to conjure a horse out of thin air, walking is our only option. She stood up, brushing dirt from her skirts, and looked around the clearing. Her camp was a complete loss, supplies trampled and scattered, her bedroll torn to shreds by wolf claws. But she spotted her canvas pack hanging from a tree branch where she'd apparently stashed it for safety, and she retrieved it with a small sound of triumph. I've got bandages, she said, pulling out a small medical kit, and some salve my mother made before she passed. It's good for cuts and infections. Sit down and let me wrap your feet before we go anywhere. Declan wanted to argue, wanted to just push through the pain and get them both to safety, but the look in Willa's eyes told him she wouldn't take no for an answer. He sat down on a fallen log and let her work, watching as she carefully cleaned each cut with water from her canteen, applied the sweet-smelling salve, and wrapped his feet in strips of clean linen bandage. You're good at this, he observed. Learn that from your mother? She was a nurse before she married my father, Willa explained, her fingers working quickly and efficiently. She taught me everything she knew about treating injuries and illnesses. Said a woman should always know how to tend to the sick and wounded, that it was a valuable skill no matter where life took her. She tied off the last bandage and sat back on her heels. I think she'd be proud to know those lessons saved my life tonight. If I hadn't known to kick apart my fire to make a torch, those wolves would have gotten me for sure. She'd be proud of a lot more than that, Declan said. You kept your head in a bad situation, didn't panic even when you had every right to. That takes courage. Willa looked up at him, and in the growing daylight he could see her eyes were indeed dark green, the color of pine needles after rain. There was something in her gaze that made his heart beat faster, a connection he hadn't felt with anyone since his wife had died. He pushed the feeling down, told himself he was just grateful to have saved her life, nothing more. They gathered what they could salvage from her camp, which wasn't much. Her pack, a small pot, a tin cup, and a waterlogged book that might dry out eventually. Everything else was ruined or missing, dragged off by the wolves or trampled into the dirt. Willa looked at the meager pile with a rueful expression. Well, I came west with nothing, and it looks like I'm right back where I started, she said, trying for a light tone but not quite managing it. At least I still have my teaching certificate. That's in the pack, wrapped in oilcloth. You've got more than that, Declan said, slinging her pack over his shoulder, along with his own possessions, which consisted of the knife she'd taken from his belt and nothing else. You've got your life, your health, and a place to stay until we figure out what to do next. My cabin's not much, but it's got a roof and walls and a door that locks. You're welcome to it for as long as you need. Willa looked like she wanted to argue, probably about propriety or reputation or any of the other things town women worried about, but exhaustion and relief won out. Thank you, she said simply. I promise I won't be a burden for long, just until I can get back to Fort Leon and sort out the schoolhouse situation. The walk back to Declan's cabin took nearly 2 hours, made longer by his injured feet and the need to navigate carefully through the forest. Willa stayed close to his side, supporting him when the pain got too bad, lending him her strength when his own threatened to give out. They didn't talk much, saving their breath for the difficult journey, but there was a comfortable silence between them, the kind that came from shared danger and mutual respect. When the cabin finally came into view, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, Willa made a small sound of approval. It was rough-built but solid, with a stone chimney and real glass windows that must have cost a fortune to haul up here. A small stream ran nearby, providing fresh water, and there was a decent-sized garden plot that had been harvested for the season. You built this yourself? She asked as Declan pushed open the door and gestured for her to enter. Most of it, he confirmed. Had some help with the chimney from a stonemason in Fort Lynn, but the rest is my work. Took me most of a year to get it finished, but it's home now. The interior was sparse but clean. A single large room with a bed in one corner, a table and chairs in another, and a stone fireplace dominating the far wall. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies and equipment, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a pleasant herbal scent. A bearskin rug covered the wooden floor, and the bed was made up with thick wool blankets that looked warm and inviting. "You take the bed," Declan said, lowering himself into one of the chairs with a grunt of pain. "I'll sleep on the floor. It won't be the first time." "Absolutely not," Willa said firmly. "You're injured because of me. I'll take the floor. I'm twice your size and lived rough for years," Declan countered. "You'll take the bed and that's final. I'm not going to argue about it." They stared at each other for a long moment, wills clashing, and then Willa's lips twitched into the first smile Declan had seen from her. "You're very stubborn, you know that. Been called worse," he replied, returning the smile with one of his own. It felt strange on his face, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. "Now are you hungry? I've got salt pork, beans, and some sourdough bread I baked yesterday. Not fancy, but it'll fill you up." "I'm starving," Willa admitted. "I haven't eaten since noon yesterday." While Declan built up the fire and started preparing food, Willa explored the cabin, her curiosity evident in every glance and gesture. She paused at the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of a surprisingly extensive collection. "You have books," she said, sounding delighted. "Shakespeare, Dickens, Thoreau. I wouldn't have expected a mountain man to have such a library." "I'm not just a mountain man," Declan said, a bit more defensively than he'd intended. "I had an education back in Missouri, went to a real school and everything. Just because I choose to live out here doesn't mean I've given up on learning." "I didn't mean to offend you," Willa said quickly. "I just meant it's wonderful. I love to read, always have. It's one of the things I missed most when I had to sell my father's library to pay his debts. There were books I'd known my whole life, books he used to read to me as a child, and I had to watch strangers carry them away." Declan felt that twist in his chest again, that pull toward her that he didn't quite understand. "Well, you can read any of these you want while you're here. I've been through most of them 3 or 4 times already. Fresh eyes might be nice." They ate together at the small table, the simple food tasting like a feast after the night they'd had. Willa told him more about Boston, about her life as a professor's daughter, about the shock of discovering her father's debts and the scramble to salvage something from the wreckage of her old life. Declan found himself talking too, more than he had in years, telling her about his childhood on a farm in Missouri, about meeting his wife at a church social when he was 19, about the joy of becoming a father and the devastating loss that had driven him west. "What was his name?" Willa asked softly. "Your son, Daniel," Declan said, and the name felt like both a blessing and a knife in his heart. "Daniel James Hawthorne. He was 3 years old when he died, just starting to talk in full sentences and ask a million questions about everything. He loved animals, used to follow me around the farm, trying to help with the chickens and the pigs." He paused, swallowing hard. "I think about him every day. Wonder what kind of man he would have grown up to be." Willa reached across the table and took his hand, the same gesture she'd made in the tree, and this time Declan didn't pull away. Her touch was warm and solid, anchoring him to the present when memories threatened to drag him under. "He would have been like you," she said with quiet certainty. "Brave and strong and willing to run into danger to help someone in need. That's who you are, Declan, and that's what you would have taught him to be." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped across the table. And something shifted between them, some invisible barrier falling away. Declan found himself noticing details he'd been too busy to see before. The way Willa's dark hair caught the firelight, the small scar above her left eyebrow, the determined set of her jaw that suggested she'd faced down more than just wolves in her life. After breakfast, Willa insisted on checking his feet again and changing the bandages. The cuts were already starting to heal, the salve having done its work, but they were still tender and bruised. She worked with the same gentle efficiency, her hands sure and steady, and Declan found himself watching her face instead of what she was doing. "You'll need to stay off these for at least a day or 2, she said, tying off the fresh bandages. "No walking, no standing for long periods. Just rest and let your body heal." "Can't do that," Declan protested. "I've got traps to check, firewood to split, a dozen things that need doing before winter comes." "The traps can wait one day," Willa said firmly, "and I can split firewood. My father might have been a professor, but we couldn't always afford servants. I know how to do physical work, Declan. Let me help you the way you helped me." He wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. This was important to her, he realized, this need to not be a burden, to pay her own way. He understood that, had felt the same way himself more times than he could count. "All right," he said, "but you take breaks when you need them, and you come get me if anything seems wrong. There are bears in these woods and mountain lions, and you need to be careful." I'll be careful, Willa promised. Now you rest and I'll go split some firewood. Declan watched from the cabin window as Willa worked, her movements efficient and practiced as she split log after log. She'd changed out of her torn skirts into a pair of his old trousers, rolled up at the waist and ankles to fit her smaller frame, and one of his shirts that hung nearly to her knees. She looked beautiful in his clothes, he thought, then immediately felt guilty for thinking it. His wife had been dead only 3 years, and here he was admiring another woman. But Mary wouldn't want you to be alone forever. A quiet voice in his head whispered, she loved you too much to want you to suffer. He pushed the thought away and forced himself to lie down on the bearskin rug, elevating his feet on a pile of folded blankets. Sleep came quickly, exhaustion from the long night finally catching up with him, and he dreamed of wolves and firelight and dark green eyes that held secrets he wanted to unravel. When he woke, the sun was high overhead and the cabin smelled of cooking food. Willa was at the fireplace, stirring something in his big iron pot, and she turned to smile at him when she heard him stirring. Good, you're awake, she said. I found some dried venison in your stores and made a stew. I hope that's all right. More than all right, Declan said, sitting up and wincing at the stiffness in his feet. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, Willa said simply. Besides, you saved my life last night. Cooking you one meal seems like the least I can do. They ate the stew together, and Declan had to admit it was better than anything he'd made in months. Willa had added herbs from his collection and some wild onions she'd found growing near the stream, and the result was rich and flavorful, warming him from the inside out. You're a good cook, he said. Better than me, and I've been feeding myself for 3 years now. My mother again, Willa explained. She believed in practical skills, cooking, sewing, healing, all the things that would help me survive no matter what life threw at me. She paused, then added softly, I miss her. She died when I was 16, and sometimes I still find myself wanting to ask her advice about things. What would she say about this situation, Declan asked. About you staying here with me, alone with no chaperone or propriety. Willa considered the question, her head tilted thoughtfully. She'd say that survival comes before society's rules, that staying alive and safe is more important than worrying what narrow-minded people might think. She was practical like that, never cared much for social conventions when they got in the way of living a real life. Smart woman, Declan said. I think I would have liked her. I think she would have liked you too, Willa replied. She always said the measure of a man wasn't in his words or his wealth, but in what he did when nobody was watching. You ran into danger to save a stranger, Declan. That says more about your character than anything else could. The day passed in comfortable companionship, Willa reading from one of his books while Declan carved a new handle for his hunting knife, his feet propped up as ordered. They talked about books and philosophy, about the differences between Boston and the Western frontier, about everything and nothing. Declan found himself laughing more than he had in years. Surprised by Willa's sharp wit and quick humor, as evening approached, Willa insisted on checking his feet again and was pleased to report that they were healing well. The swelling had gone down and most of the cuts were already scabbing over. The salve really works, Declan observed. What's in it? Honey, beeswax, and plantain leaves mostly, Willa said. My mother learned the recipe from an old woman in our neighborhood who'd been a midwife for 50 years. She used to say honey could heal anything, that it was nature's medicine. She wasn't wrong, Declan said. I've used honey on wounds before and seen them heal twice as fast as they would have otherwise. That night, they sat by the fire after supper, Willa in one of the chairs and Declan stretched out on the bearskin rug. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and outside an owl hooted softly in the darkness. It was peaceful, domestic, and Declan realized with a start that he liked having Willa here, liked the sound of another person moving through his space, liked the conversation and companionship he'd been denying himself for so long. Tell me about Fort Lyon, Willa said after a while. What should I expect when I go back there to deal with the schoolhouse situation? Declan frowned, thinking about the town he'd only visited when absolutely necessary. It's rough, he said honestly. Founded about 10 years ago as a trading post, grew into a real town when silver was discovered in the hills nearby. There are maybe 500 people living there now, mostly miners and their families, plus the usual collection of merchants, saloon keepers, and people looking to make a quick dollar off the boom. The law is hit or miss. We've got a sheriff, but he's more interested in protecting the mine owners than keeping the peace for regular folks. Sounds challenging, Willa said, but I've dealt with difficult situations before. I can handle Fort Lyon. I don't doubt it, Declan replied. But I'll come with you when you're ready to go back. Make sure you get treated fairly, that they honor their commitment to rebuild the schoolhouse and give you a place to live. You shouldn't have to fight those battles alone. You don't have to do that, Willa protested. You've already done so much for me. I want to, Declan said firmly. Besides, I need to stock up on supplies before winter comes anyway. Might as well make the trip together. They were quiet for a while, and then Willa asked the question he'd been half expecting since she arrived. Do you ever get lonely up here, Declan? Living by yourself, no one to talk to for days or weeks at a time? He took his time answering, wanting to be honest but not wanting to seem pathetic. Yes, he finally said, yes, I get lonely. But lonely felt safer than trying to build something new, trying to care about someone again only to risk losing them. After Mary and Daniel died, I didn't think I could survive that kind of loss a second time. So I came up here where I couldn't hurt anyone, and no one could hurt me. That's not living, though, Willa said softly. That's just existing. There's a difference. I know, Declan admitted. I've known it for a while now, but I didn't know what to do about it. Didn't know how to start living again when I'd gotten so good at just surviving. Willa stood up and crossed to where he lay, settling onto the rug beside him with her back against the stone hearth. Maybe we both need to learn how to live again, she said. You've been hiding from loss and I've been running from it. But we're still here, Declan. We survived when we could have died. Maybe that means something. Maybe it does, he said, turning his head to look at her. In the firelight, she was beautiful, but it was more than that. She was strong and brave and kind, everything he'd thought he'd never find again, everything he'd told himself he didn't deserve. Thank you for saving my life, Willa said, her hand finding his on the rug between them. I know I've said it before, but I don't think you understand what it meant. I was so scared, Declan. I thought I was going to die up there on that rock, that those wolves were going to wait me out until my torch burned down and then tear me apart. And then you came crashing through the trees like some kind of avenging angel, and I knew I was going to be all right. I couldn't let you die, Declan said simply, not when I had the power to stop it. They sat like that, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down to embers, and when Willa finally went to bed in the corner, Declan lay awake on the rug for a long time, thinking about loss and loneliness and the possibility of something new. The next 3 days fell into an easy rhythm. Declan's feet healed quickly under Willa's care, and by the 4th day he was able to walk without pain. They worked together around the cabin, Declan checking his trap lines while Willa tended the garden and prepared meals, and in the evenings they would read or talk by the fire. Learning more about each other with every conversation, Declan found himself looking forward to those evenings most of all, to the sound of Willa's voice as she read aloud from Shakespeare or Dickens, to the way she laughed at his stories about life in the mountains, to the comfortable silence that fell between them when words weren't needed. He was falling for her, he realized slowly but surely, like a man stepping off a cliff in slow motion. And the terrifying part was that he didn't want to stop. Willa seemed to be feeling something too, if the way she looked at him was any indication. He'd catch her watching him sometimes when she thought he wasn't paying attention, her dark green eyes soft and thoughtful. She'd started touching him more, casual brushes of her hand against his arm, fingers lingering when she checked his healing feet, sitting close enough on the rug that their shoulders touched. On the 5th day, Declan took her to his favorite spot in the mountains, a high meadow about an hour's walk from the cabin where wildflowers still bloomed despite the late season, and you could see for miles in every direction. They sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley, sharing bread and cheese from his pack, and Willa made a sound of pure contentment. "This is beautiful," she said, her face turned up to the sun. "I can see why you love it up here. It's like the rest of the world doesn't exist, like all the pain and loss and difficulty just falls away." "That's exactly why I came here," Declan said. "After Mary and Daniel died, I needed a place where I could breathe again, where every street corner and building didn't remind me of what I'd lost. These mountains gave me that." "Do you still think about them every day?" Willa asked. "Every day," Declan confirmed, "but it's different now than it was 3 years ago. Back then, the memories were like knives, cutting me every time they surfaced. Now they're gentler, more like photographs I can look at without bleeding. I'll always love them, always miss them, but the pain has dulled to an ache instead of an open wound." Willa was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think my father would have liked you. He was a scholar, spent his whole life with his head in books, but he respected practical men, people who could build things with their hands and survive in difficult circumstances. He used to say that real intelligence wasn't just about what you knew, but about what you could do with that knowledge." "Your father sounds like a good man," Declan said. "Even if he wasn't good with money." "He was a dreamer," Willa said with a sad smile. "Always believed the next investment would be the one that paid off, that his luck would turn around any day. My mother tried to rein him in, but after she died, there was no one to stop him from making increasingly bad decisions. I didn't find out how bad it was until after his death, when the creditors started showing up at our door." "You loved him anyway," Declan observed. "Of course," Willa said. "Love doesn't depend on someone being perfect. It just means you accept them, flaws and all, and choose to stand by them anyway." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching a hawk circle overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. Declan found his hand drifting toward Willa's, and when their fingers intertwined, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I need to tell you something," Willa said suddenly, her voice nervous. "And I don't want you to think I'm presuming anything or being inappropriate. You can tell me anything," Declan assured her. "I won't judge you." She took a deep breath, then said in a rush, "I don't want to go back to Fort Lyon. I do. I need to settle things with the school board and figure out my employment situation, but I don't want to stay there. These past few days with you have been the happiest I've been since before my mother died, maybe even before that. I like the mountains, Declan. I like the quiet and the simplicity and the feeling that life here is about what really matters instead of all the superficial things people in cities care about. And I like you more than I probably should, given that we've only known each other a few days." Declan's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "I like you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than like, if I'm being honest. I didn't think I could feel this way again, didn't think I wanted to, but you changed something in me, Willa. You made me remember what it feels like to want a future instead of just enduring the present." "So what do we do about it?" Willa asked, turning to face him fully. "Because I don't know the rules here. In Boston, there would be courtship rituals and chaperones and a year of proper behavior before anything could be decided. But we're not in Boston, and I don't want to wait a year to see if this feeling between us is real." "It's real," Declan said with absolute certainty. "I've loved before, Willa, and I know what it feels like. This is different from what I had with Mary, because you're a different person and I'm a different man than I was then, but it's just as real, just as strong." "Then kiss me," Willa said, her eyes locked on his. "Please, Declan, I need to know if this is really happening, if I'm not just imagining the connection between us." Declan didn't need to be asked twice. He cupped her face in his large calloused hands and leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to pull away if she wanted. But she didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his broad chest, and when their lips met, it was like coming home after a long journey. The kiss started gentle, almost tentative, but quickly deepened into something more passionate, more desperate. Willa's arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, and Declan's hands slid into her hair, holding her like she was precious and fragile, despite knowing she was neither. They kissed like people who'd been drowning and had finally found air, like they were the only two people left in the world, and this moment was all that mattered. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Willa rested her forehead against his and laughed. A bright, joyful sound that made Declan's heart soar. "Well," she said, "that answered that question." "Yeah," Declan agreed, unable to stop grinning. "It really did." They stayed in the meadow for hours, talking about the future, about possibilities and plans and all the things they wanted to build together. Willa told him about her dream of starting a school, not just for children but for anyone who wanted to learn, teaching reading and writing and practical skills that would help people survive and thrive on the frontier. Declan told her about his plans to expand his trapping operation, maybe bring in a few cattle and start a small ranch, create something sustainable that could support a family. "A family," Willa repeated softly. "Is that what you want? Another chance at that?" "With you, yes," Declan said without hesitation. "I never thought I'd want that again, but I do. I want to build a life with you, Willa. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're beside me. I want to grow old in these mountains with you by my side." "I want that too," Willa said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I want it more than I've ever wanted anything. But I need to go back to Fort Lyon first, settle things properly. I owe them that much, and I need to get my affairs in order before I can start a new life." "We'll go together," Declan said. "Tomorrow, if you're ready. I'll help you deal with the school board, and then we'll figure out the rest." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and that night, Willa didn't protest when Declan pulled her down onto the bearskin rug beside him instead of sending her to the bed. They lay together in the firelight, her head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her, and talked until they fell asleep, still holding each other. The next morning they packed up supplies for the trip to Fort Lyon. Declan strapped on his gun belt, something he rarely wore at the cabin but always carried in town, and Willa changed back into her patched and mended skirts, trying to look at least somewhat presentable. They set out at dawn, making good time on the well-worn trail that led down from the mountains into the valley where Fort Lyon sprawled. The town was just as Declan remembered it, rough and loud and full of desperate people trying to make their fortunes. They arrived around midday, and Declan led Willa straight to the office of the school board chairman, a pompous man named Gerald Whitmore, who owned the largest general store in town. Whitmore was less than pleased to see them, his round face going red when Willa explained what had happened and demanded to know why she hadn't been provided with proper lodging upon her arrival. "We didn't expect you until next week," Whitmore blustered. "The letter we sent said September 15th, not September 8th. Your letter said September 8th, Willa corrected calmly, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket and laying it on his desk. See? Right there, September 8th, 1878. I arrived exactly when you told me to, and I nearly died because your town couldn't be bothered to help a woman find safe shelter. Whitmore read the letter, his face going from red to purple. There must have been a mistake in the correspondence. But that doesn't change the fact that we don't have a schoolhouse for you to teach in yet. The rebuild won't be finished until November at the earliest. Then I'll teach somewhere else until it's ready, Willa said firmly. The church, the town hall, someone's barn if necessary. You hired me to teach the children of this town, Mr. Whitmore, and that's what I intend to do. But I'll need proper lodging, and I'll need supplies. And I'll need someone to explain to me why this town is so poorly organized that a woman can arrive on the stage and not have a single person willing to help her. Declan stood beside Willa, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his presence a silent but unmistakable threat. He didn't say anything, just let his size and his obvious skill with the gun on his hip speak for him. Whitmore looked between them and seemed to deflate. Fine, he said. There's a boarding house on 3rd Street run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. I'll cover your room and board there until we can get the schoolhouse finished and the teacher's cottage repaired. And you can use the church basement for your classes. Reverend Thompson has been asking for someone to teach the children proper letters anyway. That's acceptable, Willa said. I'll also need a week to get settled before I start teaching. I lost most of my supplies when wolves attacked my camp, and I'll need to replace them. Wolves? Whitmore said, his eyebrows shooting up. Good Lord, woman, you're lucky to be alive. Those packs have been getting bolder lately, coming down from the high country looking for food. Several ranchers have lost livestock. I am lucky to be alive, Willa agreed. Thanks to Mr. Hawthorne here who heard my screams and came to my rescue. If not for him, I wouldn't be here to teach your children. Whitmore's attitude toward Declan shifted immediately, respect replacing suspicion. Well then, we owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Hawthorne. Is there anything we can do to repay you for your bravery? Just treat Miss Hart fairly, Declan said. Make sure she gets everything she was promised, and we'll call it square. They left Whitmore's office and made their way to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, a tidy 2-story building with blue shutters and a well-maintained garden. The widow who owned it was a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s who took one look at Willa and immediately bustled her inside with promises of hot tea and a comfortable room. You poor dear, Mrs. Patterson clucked. Wolves, imagine that. You must have been terrified. Well, you'll be safe here, I promise you that. I run a respectable establishment, no nonsense or carrying on, but I'm not so stuffy that I don't understand the realities of frontier life. Willa's room was small but clean, with a real bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the garden. Mrs. Patterson left them alone to get settled, but not before giving Declan a knowing look that suggested she understood exactly what was between them. It's nice, Willa said, sitting on the edge of the bed, but it's not your cabin. No, it's not, Declan agreed. He sat beside her, taking her hand. But this is where you need to be right now, at least until you've fulfilled your teaching contract. These people need you, Willa. Those children need someone to teach them, to show them there's more to life than mining silver and scraping by. I know, Willa said, and I will teach them. I'll do the job I was hired for. But Declan, I meant what I said up in that meadow. I don't want to stay here permanently. I want to be with you, in the mountains, building the life we talked about. And we will, Declan promised. But we'll do it right, Willa. I'll come down from the cabin once a week, court you properly, let the town see that we're serious about each other. And when your contract is up next summer, or when they release you from it early if they rebuild the schoolhouse fast enough, you'll come back to the mountains with me as my wife. If you'll have me, that is. Willa's eyes went wide. Are you asking me to marry you? Not officially, not yet, Declan said. I don't have a ring, and this isn't exactly the romantic proposal you deserve. But yes, Willa Hart, I'm telling you right now that I intend to marry you if you'll say yes when I ask you proper. Willa threw her arms around his neck and kissed him hard, not caring that they were in a boarding house where anyone could walk in. Yes, she said against his lips. Yes, I'll marry you. I don't need a fancy proposal or a ring. I just need you. You'll get both anyway, Declan said, grinning. But I'll take the yes and hold on to it until I can make it official. He stayed with her in Fort Leon for 2 more days, helping her get settled, replacing the supplies she'd lost, and making sure everyone in town knew she was under his protection. The message was received loud and clear, and by the time he headed back to his cabin, Willa had become something of a celebrity in Fort Leon. The brave schoolteacher who'd survived a wolf attack and won the heart of the mysterious mountain man. The weeks that followed were hard but good. Declan came down from the mountains every week like clockwork, always arriving on Sunday morning in time to escort Willa to church and spend the day with her. They'd walk through the town, have meals together at Mrs. Patterson's, and talk about their future. The people of Fort Lyon grew accustomed to seeing them together, and gradually, Willa became part of the community in a way she'd never been in Boston. Her school in the church basement was a success from the start. Children came in droves, eager to learn from the kind teacher who made lessons interesting and never talked down to them. Willa taught reading and writing, mathematics and history, but she also taught practical skills like basic first aid and accounting, things that would help her students survive and thrive in the harsh frontier environment. Declan was proud of her, proud of the way she'd thrown herself into this work despite initially planning to leave. She was making a real difference in these children's lives, giving them opportunities they never would have had otherwise, and he loved her even more for it. In November, the first snow came to the mountains, and Declan arrived in Fort Lyon with a ring in his pocket, a simple gold band he'd had made by the jeweler in town using gold he'd panned from the stream near his cabin. He proposed on a Sunday afternoon, kneeling in Mrs. Patterson's garden with snow falling gently around them, and Willa said yes through happy tears. They were married in the same church where Willa taught on a crisp December morning with half the town in attendance. Mrs. Patterson cried through the whole ceremony, and even Gerald Whitmore seemed moved by the sight of them standing together. Declan in his best suit with his hair neatly tied back, Willa in a simple white dress she'd sewn herself. The schoolhouse still wasn't finished, but the school board had hired an assistant teacher to help Willa, a young woman named Sarah who'd recently arrived from Denver. Willa agreed to stay on through the end of the school year in June, teaching alongside Sarah and training her to take over as head teacher when Willa left for the mountains. They spent their first months of marriage split between two worlds, Willa in Fort Lyon during the week and Declan coming down to stay with her on weekends, then both of them going up to the cabin during school breaks. It wasn't ideal, but they made it work, and the anticipation of their reunions made every moment together even sweeter. When June finally arrived and the school year ended, Willa said goodbye to her students with tears and promises to visit. The schoolhouse had been rebuilt, beautiful and solid, with a teacher's cottage beside it that Sarah moved into immediately. Willa packed up her belongings from Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, hugged the widow tight, and climbed into Declan's wagon for the ride up to the cabin that would be her permanent home. That first night back in the mountains as a permanent resident instead of a visitor, Willa stood on the porch of the cabin and looked out at the star-filled sky, Declan's arms wrapped around her from behind. "I'm home," she said softly. "Really home for the first time since my mother died." "We both are," Declan replied, resting his chin on top of her head. "We found each other, Willa. Against all the odds, through wolves and loss and fear, we found each other." "Do you think they'd be happy for us?" Willa asked. "You're Mary and Daniel, my parents. Do you think they'd approve?" "I know they would," Declan said with certainty. "Love doesn't diminish when you lose someone. It just makes room for new love alongside the old. Mary would want me to be happy, to build a life again, and your parents would want the same for you. They'd be glad we found each other, glad we're not alone anymore." Willa turned in his arms and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. "I love you, Declan Hawthorne. I loved you from that first night when you came crashing through the forest to save me, even though I didn't know it yet. You're the bravest, kindest, most wonderful man I've ever known, and I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you." "I love you too," Declan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me back my life, Willa. You made me want to live again instead of just survive. You're my second chance, my redemption, my everything." The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work and simple joys. Declan expanded his trapping operation and started a small ranch like he'd planned, bringing in cattle and horses that thrived in the mountain pastures. Willa planted a bigger garden and learned to preserve food for the long winters. And she started her dream of an informal school, teaching reading and writing to anyone who ventured up to their cabin seeking knowledge. In the spring of 1880, their first child was born, a daughter they named Mary Abigail after Declan's first wife and Willa's mother. Declan held his daughter for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the gift of a second chance at fatherhood. Willa, exhausted but radiant, watched her husband cradle their baby and knew that the ghosts of their pasts had finally been laid to rest. 2 years later, a son arrived, and they named him Daniel William, honoring both the son Declan had lost and the dreams Willa's father had held. As Declan watched his children grow, teaching them to fish and track and read the signs of the forest, he felt his old wounds finally heal completely. The love he'd had for his first family would always be a part of him, but it no longer hurt. It was just part of his story, part of what had made him into the man who could love Willa and their children with his whole heart. Willa flourished in the mountains, becoming known throughout the region as a healer and teacher, someone you could go to for help no matter what your problem was. She delivered babies for families who couldn't afford a doctor, taught children and adults alike to read and write, and created a sense of community among the scattered mountain folk who'd never had much use for each other before. Fort Lyon continued to grow, becoming a proper town with schools and churches and law enforcement that actually worked. Gerald Whitmore's general store expanded into a chain, and he eventually credited much of his success to Willa's early work teaching the children of miners and prospectors, giving them the skills to build better lives. Every year on the anniversary of the night Declan had saved her from the wolves, Willa and Declan would return to that clearing near Willow Creek and sit by a fire, remembering how close they'd come to never finding each other. They'd hold hands and watch the flames and feel grateful for every moment they'd been given, every day they'd had together since that terrifying night. "Do you ever regret it?" Willa asked on their 10th anniversary, their children sleeping peacefully back at the cabin under Mrs. Patterson's watchful eye. The elderly widow had retired to a small house near their property, becoming a beloved grandmother figure to Mary and Daniel. "Coming to Fort Lyon, going through everything you went through to get here." "Not for a second," Declan said, pulling her close. "Every step of my journey, every loss and every choice led me to that night when I heard you scream, led me to you. How could I regret the path that brought me everything I never knew I needed? I used to think my father's death and all those debts were the worst things that could have happened to me," Willa reflected. "I thought my life was over, that I'd never be happy again. But they led me here to you, to this life we've built, and I wouldn't trade it for anything, not even to have my old life back." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to the night sounds of the forest. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and Willa tensed for just a moment before relaxing back against Declan's solid chest. "Just singing to the moon," Declan murmured, his arms tightening around her. "They're not hunting tonight, just talking to each other. Telling their own stories, I suppose. I wonder what they'd say about us," Willa mused. "The wolf that brought us together, the pack that tried to kill me but ended up giving me everything I ever wanted." "They'd probably say we're lucky," Declan replied. "And they'd be right, we're the luckiest two people in all of Colorado, maybe in the whole world." As they grew older together, Declan's hair turning silver and Willa's face gaining laugh lines around her eyes, they never stopped being grateful for each other. Their children grew up strong and capable, Mary becoming a teacher like her mother and Daniel learning his father's trade, taking over the ranch when Declan's joint started protesting the hard work. The cabin grew too, expanded with additions and improvements, until it was a proper house that could accommodate their growing family and the grandchildren, who started arriving in the late 1890s. Willa's informal school became a real one-room schoolhouse that she built with money earned from her healing work, and children came from miles around to learn from the legendary mountain teacher. Declan, even as age slowed him down, remained the protector he'd always been. He taught his son and grandsons to respect the wilderness but never fear it, to understand that survival depended on knowledge and preparation more than strength. He told them the story of the night he'd run barefoot through the forest to save their grandmother, and they listened with wide eyes, understanding that their very existence depended on that moment of courage. On their 25th anniversary, Fort Lyon threw them a celebration, the whole town turning out to honor the couple who'd become legends in their own right. The mayor gave a speech about how Willa's teaching had transformed the community, raising up a whole generation of educated, capable citizens who'd made Fort Lyon into one of the most prosperous towns in Colorado. Gerald Whitmore, now a state representative, talked about how Declan's example of quiet courage and integrity had shown what a real man could be. But the moment Willa and Declan treasured most came at the end of the celebration, when all their children and grandchildren gathered around them, a family of 15 strong, all alive and healthy and happy. Mary played the piano while everyone sang, and Daniel stood up to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded room, "who taught us that love is stronger than loss, that courage means running toward danger to help someone in need, and that the best things in life are worth waiting for. You've given us a legacy of love and strength that we'll pass on to our own children, and theirs after them. We love you, and we're grateful every day that you found each other." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as everyone raised their glasses, and Willa leaned against Declan's shoulder, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was what they'd built from that terrible, wonderful night when wolves howled and a mountain man ran barefoot through the darkness. This family, this love, this life that neither of them had thought they'd ever have again. When they finally retired for the night, walking slowly back to their home in the mountains with the stars bright overhead, Willa stopped and looked up at the sky, at the vast sweep of the Milky Way that you could only see out here far from city lights. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was thanking. "God, fate, the universe itself. Thank you for wolves and darkness and a man brave enough to run through both." "Thank you for being worth saving," Declan replied, understanding exactly what she meant. for being the reason I learned to live again. They spent their final years together in the cabin they'd built and expanded, surrounded by family and friends, never regretting a single moment of the life they'd chosen. Declan passed first, in his sleep at the age of 78, his hand still clasped in Willa's even in death. She mourned him deeply but not desperately, knowing they'd had more years together than many couples could dream of. Willa lived another 3 years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren born, long enough to pass on her knowledge and wisdom to the next generation of mountain folk. When her time came, she died peacefully in the same cabin where she'd found her home, surrounded by everyone she loved. They buried her next to Declan on a hill overlooking the valley, with a view of the mountains they'd both loved so much. The headstone was simple. Wilhelmina Hart Hawthorne, 1855–1909. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, teacher and healer. She lived without fear and loved without reservation. Beside it, Declan's headstone read, Declan Hawthorne, 1853–1906. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. He ran toward danger to save a stranger and found his reason to live. Years later, when their great-great-grandchildren asked about the people buried on that hill, they would hear the story of the mountain man who heard a wolf howl near her camp and ran barefoot through the dark to reach her. They'd hear about courage and love, about second chances, and the way two broken people had healed each other. They'd learn that the best love stories aren't about perfection, but about two people choosing each other again and again, through hardship and joy, through loss and redemption. And sometimes on quiet nights when the moon was full and the wolves were singing in the high country, people swore they could see two figures walking hand in hand through the mountain meadows, still together, still in love, still proving that some bonds are strong enough to last forever. The cabin still stands, maintained by the family as a historical landmark and a reminder of the love that built it. Visitors come from all over to see where Declan and Willa lived, to walk the trails they walked and stand in the clearing where it all began. The wolves are still there too, their descendants hunting in the same mountains, howling at the same moon, part of the wild beauty that brought two people together in the most unexpected way. And in Fort Lyon, now a thriving city of 30,000, the Wilhelmina Hart Hawthorne School for Girls stands as a testament to the teacher who believed everyone deserved an education, regardless of their circumstances. The Declan Hawthorne Wildlife Preserve protects 10,000 acres of mountain wilderness, ensuring that future generations will know the beauty and danger of the wild places that shaped a man into a hero. Their story became legend told around campfires and in classrooms, a reminder that love can bloom in the darkest moments, that courage isn't the absence of fear but the choice to act despite it, and that sometimes the scariest night of your life is actually the beginning of everything good that comes after. The descendants of Declan and Willa still live in Colorado, spread throughout the state, but always maintaining a connection to those mountains where it all began. Every year, on the anniversary of that September night in 1878, they gather at the cabin for a reunion, bringing food and stories and gratitude for the two people who loved each other enough to build something that would last generations. They tell the story again and again, each retelling adding new details or emphasizing different aspects, but the core remains the same. A mountain man heard a woman scream, and instead of staying safe in his cabin, instead of protecting himself, he ran barefoot through the dark forest toward danger. And that choice, that moment of courage and compassion, changed everything, because that's what real love does. It doesn't wait for the right moment or the perfect circumstances. It doesn't calculate risks or worry about consequences. It hears someone in need and runs toward them, barefoot in the darkness, willing to face wolves and worse for the chance to help, to save, to connect. Declan and Willa's love story wasn't perfect. It was born from trauma and loss, built on foundations of grief and loneliness. But they chose each other, chose to build something new from the ruins of their old lives, and in doing so, they created a legacy that would outlast them by generations. That's the lesson their descendants carry forward, that it's never too late to start over, never too late to find love, never too late to be brave. That sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to something better if we're courageous enough to walk through them. That running barefoot toward danger for someone else is worth every cut and bruise, because connection and love and human kindness are worth any price. The mountains still stand, eternal and unchanging, watching over the valley where two lives intertwined and created something beautiful. The wolves still howl at the moon, their voices echoing through the darkness, a reminder of the night everything changed. And somewhere in those mountains, in the cabin that love built, the spirit of that courage and devotion lives on, inspiring everyone who hears the story to be a little braver, a little more open to possibility, a little more willing to run toward the darkness if someone on the other side needs them. Because in the end, that's what it means to be human, to be alive, to be capable of love. It means hearing the call for help and answering it, even when you're scared, even when it costs you something, even when you don't know how the story will end. It means trusting that love is worth the risk, that connection is worth the vulnerability, that sometimes the best things in life come from the most terrifying moments. Declan Hawthorne and Wilhelmina Hart understood that truth in their bones, lived it every day of their long lives together, and passed it down to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And because they did, because they chose love over fear and connection over isolation, their story will never truly end. It lives on in every person who hears it and decides to be brave, in every act of courage driven by compassion, in every love story that begins in darkness and grows toward the light. That September night in 1878, when wolves howled and a mountain man ran barefoot through the forest, was the beginning of something that would echo through time, touching lives that wouldn't exist without that moment of courage. It was the night two broken people found each other and decided that love was worth fighting for, worth building a life around, worth every sacrifice and struggle that came with it. And they were right. Every day they spent together proved them right. Every child born from their union, every grandchild who carries their blood and their legacy, every great-great-grandchild who benefits from the choices they made, all of it proves that running barefoot through the darkness towards someone in need is always worth it. The story ends where it began, with mountains and moonlight and the distant howl of wolves. But it's not really an ending, because love like theirs never truly ends. It transforms, evolves, passes from one generation to the next, but the core of it remains eternal. Two people chose each other in the hardest possible circumstances and built something that would outlast them, something that would inspire and sustain their family for generations to come. That's the real legacy of the mountain man who heard a wolf howl near her camp and ran barefoot through the dark to reach her. Not just the family he created with her, not just the love they shared, but the example they set, the story they gave to everyone who came after. A story that says, be brave, be kind, be willing to run toward danger for someone else. Because you never know when that moment of courage will change your entire life. When that barefoot run through the darkness will lead you to everything you've been looking for. Declan and Willa found their happily ever after in those Colorado mountains, built it with their own hands from love and determination, and sheer stubborn refusal to let their pasts define their futures. They proved that second chances are real, that love can bloom after loss, that the human heart is resilient enough to open again even after it's been shattered. Their cabin still stands on its hill, windows glowing warm in the mountain darkness, a beacon for anyone who needs to be reminded that courage and love can conquer anything. The wolves still sing their ancient songs in the forest, their voices carrying across the years, eternal and wild and free. And two names carved into a headstone on a windswept hill tell the story of what happens when one person's cry for help meets another person's willingness to answer, no matter the cost. This is the story of Declan Hawthorne and Wilhelmina Hart, the mountain man and the teacher, the protector and the healer, two souls who found each other in the darkness and chose to build a life in the light. It's a love story, yes, but more than that, it's a reminder that we're all capable of heroism, all capable of love, all capable of running barefoot through the dark if someone needs us on the other side. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, that run through the darkness leads us exactly where we were always meant to be, to the person we were always meant to love, to the life we were always meant to live. That's what happened to Declan and Willa, and their story stands as proof that even in the wildest, hardest, most unforgiving places, love can not only survive but thrive, growing strong and deep and eternal. The end of their story is really just the beginning of a legacy that continues to this day in the family they created, the community they served, and the example they set. They lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind something that will never be forgotten. The story of a man who ran barefoot through wolf-haunted darkness to save a stranger, and in doing so, saved himself.